One of the things that I believe has made Australian democracy healthy over the years is something that would never be accepted in America, and that is compulsory voting. But because we have compulsory voting, it forces our politicians to appeal to the centre, even in their campaigning. Well, especially in their campaigning. And when we watch electoral campaigns in America, we're somewhat stunned by how much politicians can appeal to hardcore political fanatics and not to the centre. And I'm wondering, when will American politics get back to, I mean, that's too big a question, but how do we get politicians to appeal to the middle more than what they're doing at the moment?
No, you make a fantastic point, and I've never thought enough about the issue of compulsory voting. I've pondered it from time to time, but your diagnosis, I think, is exactly right. Because one of the things that compulsory voting means, and this is so obvious it's painful to say it, but it needs to be said, is one strategy that is not available to Australian parties is to prevent your political opponents from voting.
Yeah.
So if you know that you have, and you have a multi-party system, not a two-party system, but if you know you have 38% and you need to get to 44% to be safe and to govern, you don't have the option in Australia of saying, well, let's just take 6 points of the electorate and prevent them from voting. You have to find some way to reach, okay, I know 38% like me, there are 6% who I need who are more skeptical, I have to win them over. But in the United States, you do have the option, parties do have the option of somehow preventing the other side from vote, or knocking out its votes, or making its votes not count equally. And this has become more and more acute in the 2010s. So the Republicans have become more, they have this, and I've been writing about this for a while, they have this problem, their political message, which worked so well in the 20th century, has not worked well in the 21st, and has worked decreasingly well in the 21st. And in the Tea Party years, it really failed, that they just were not connecting with American majorities. Donald Trump was a minority president. George W. Bush in his first election was a minority president. But because there was always the option or the hope that if you just ran the system correctly, you could stop enough people who don't like you from voting, then you could run a base-first campaign. And that is absolutely the Donald Trump plan for 2020. Base only plus voter suppression, maybe I can eke it out. And while I'm not sure I walk all the way with you on compulsory voting, I think and why I argue about this in the book, is we need to have a real commitment to a new Voting Rights Act in the United States to take away from politicians the option of stopping people from voting as a way to win.
Yes, I think that's a very good idea. So you mentioned that you've been a critic of the Republican Party for a long time. I mean, you identify as a conservative, but you have criticized the Republican Party since before Donald Trump emerged. And
I was a very loyal critic.
And you, on a podcast with Jonathan Kay recently on the Quillette podcast, you mentioned that you were criticizing the Republican Party because you could see Trump coming, or someone like him coming along. And the dogmas that you were criticizing were dogmas around the free market, such as, immigration is always a net benefit, there are no costs involved with immigration, living standards don't need to be addressed, and those types of things. Do you think that some of these free market dogmas or orthodoxies that the Republican Party adhered to for decades, do you think ultimately they are responsible for the creation of Trump?
Yeah. I became involved in politics I became politically aware in the late 70s, at a time when the great economic problems were inflation and just general economic inefficiency. When union power was a real check on productivity, not so much in the United States, although in the United States too, but it's very much in peer countries, and in which there was a lattice of regulation left over from the war and the Depression that just had long ago stopped making sense. Younger viewers will find this incredible, but in the United States, in 1980, in the year when I went to college, there was one telephone company for the whole United States. There were no choices. You got whatever products that single telephone monopoly chose to make available to you. And if they didn't think the fax machine was a technology of the future, you didn't get a fax machine. You would read about it that the Japanese have it, but until the telephone monopoly made it available. So through the 70s and 80s, Republicans had a series of answers to those things, and it was very dynamic and exciting. And I think they were mostly right about all of those things back that they said between 1975 and 1985. They sort of, as the unions warned, they sort of worked themselves out of a job, though. They solved a lot of the problems they'd come into being to solve. So when I started wandering in the middle 2000, after about 2005, I started wandering pragmatically at first. I said, we're not going to be a very competitive political organization because we're not talking about what people care about. Inflation really is dead and not coming back. But over time, what began as a pragmatic opposition, as we each went our separate ways, and I wandered one path, and the party became more extreme, more fanatical, more authoritarian, and then you alluded to a story I told Jonathan Kay. When Trump appeared in 2016, I had a friend who was very close to the campaign who asked me why I wasn't attracted to it, because here was Donald Trump, and actually he was talking about themes I talked about. He was talking about we need less immigration, we need a healthcare guarantee, we need to pay more attention to the economic concerns of the middle class. Opioids is really an epidemic, it really is killing people. It's not fake news, we have to address it. And I said to my friend, but I was talking about those things because I saw Trump coming and I wanted to stop him. Not Trump the man, but Trump the thing. Yeah. I'm not going to now that he's here, say, okay, good, this is what I wanted. This is the Gollum I didn't want.
Yes. Well, it strikes me that you're in a position to criticize the right wing of America or the American Republican Party. Do you think some of your criticism comes from the fact that you grew up in another country or you're from another country that has more moderate politics potentially?
For sure. I mean, being Canadian has, I was born a Canadian citizen. I still spend a lot of time in Canada. I spend my summers there. I have a house there. My sister's a member of the Canadian Senate. I'm very closely bound to Canada. And I think one way it has an impact is a lot of what drives American conservatism is simple unawareness of how things are in the rest of the developed world. I remember in 2010 when Marco Rubio was appearing as a national figure. He was a Florida politician and he was running for U.S. Senate in 2010. He made a speech at CPAC in which he said, the United States is the only country in the world where it doesn't matter who you are or what your background is, but if you have a good idea, you can rise and make a success of yourself. And I think the Australians, you can do that in Australia. Yeah, and you can do it in Canada. You can do it in Denmark. You can do it in Great Britain. You can actually do it in quite a lot of places. And that sense of, there are other peer democracy that it is so often true in the United States. A problem is presented and Americans look to their history and never think to ask, I wonder how other countries have addressed this problem. Maybe it's not as hard as it looks. And so simply doing comparative politics just because I cross the border twice a year, more often than that, but I think that's had a big impact on me.
Sure. But you did mention before that religion is a central part of American culture, and it obviously has been since its founding, and I think there are more evangelicals in the United States than other countries, certainly advanced economies. Is this hyper-politicization and increasing polarization connected somehow to those roots of religious minorities leaving Europe and finding a new home in America, and somehow there's this strain of religious type thinking embedded deep into the culture? I mean, that's a bit broad question, but I'm wondering what you think about that.
No, I think that's clearly right, but I would say right now, the thing that I'm most impressed by is it is the withdrawal of religion. I mean, the movement we call wokeism is a religious movement. I mean, its very name, it's woke, awakening. You know, I once was blind and now I see. I mean, the United States had a great awakening in the 1740s. That was a religious movement. It had a great awakening in the 1840s, another religious movement, and now we're having this awakening. And it has in its rituals of confession and condemnation, in its belief in sins that your own deeds will never suffice to atone for, and only through grace given to you from unbought from an external source can you achieve salvation. It has a lot of the structures of a faith. And I think one of the things, and I may come at this from a different place. I mean, I'm not a highly observant person, but I am a religious person, and I think the central idea of liberal politics with this lowercase l, its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability is it solves the problems of how do we live together peacefully, how do we develop our economy, how do we resolve differences, but it doesn't answer the really important questions. What should I live for? What does it mean to live a full and satisfying life? It doesn't. It's not the job of politics to answer those questions. Our job in politics is to preserve the space for you to find the answer for yourself. And then people say, I can't. I don't know. I need someone to give it to me. And God doesn't feel like God is there anymore for me. And certainly organized religion, I don't trust that. So I need someone to give me this meaning. And your politics, it just feels like thin gruel. All you're saying is we do it your way, and the economy will be a little bit better one decade from the next, or the next decade from the last.
But do you think that, yes, America has secularized and really organized religion has retreated from the public sphere to some degree, but the way people are taking on politics as part of their identity, and not just on the intersectional left, but also on the right with the adherence to the Make America Great Again cult, this infusing politics with identity, has that filled the place where a vacuum has been left because organized religion has left the public sphere or is less dominant?
Well, I can only be very impressionistic about this, but during the 2016 campaign, when Donald Trump was winning the Republican nomination, pollsters found that Donald Trump did very badly with Republicans who went to church at least once a week. They preferred Ted Cruz, especially, but other candidates too. Yeah. The typical Trump voter, before he consolidated the nomination, or in the spring and summer of 2016, the typical Trump voter was someone who'd been raised as an evangelical, but had stopped attending church.
Right. Interesting.
There are people from evangelicalism was a cultural identity, but not really an intense faith. Now, since then, he has consolidated the religious evangelicals behind him too. But I think for a lot of evangelicals, evangelical is both an ethnicity and a religion. And it can remain, I mean, it's weird because there's nothing ethnic about it, but it functions as an ethnicity. And even after you cease to be active in the church, even if you're living in a way that the pastors of your church wouldn't approve, you retain a sense of yourself as an evangelical Christian. And Christian is often a way of saying, I'm a white American from a family that's been here for a long time with a bias toward the South and the Midwest, even though maybe I don't believe in God so very, very much anymore.
Talking about the cultural identity of those evangelicals, I'm wondering how politicians who want to move on from Trump and the Trump presidency, how they engage with those voters in a way that is not dismissive of their concerns and needs and desires. Yeah. I think one of the big things that I've noticed from being an outsider and watching American politics play out is that and it's not just me, I've noticed a lot of people say that they don't like Trump, but they understand why people voted for him. And so, however, many pockets of the US media scorn or make fun of people who do vote for Trump. So how do we reduce that alienation?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to be completely clinical about this because um, Donald Trump is a thuggish, corrupt, and cruel figure, and it's a bad act to support him. And so I'm about to speak clinically about this, but I don't want to relinquish entirely the moral judgment. It's a wrong thing to do, and you shouldn't ever be sarcastic or sneering or superior in your judgments, but you also shouldn't withhold judgment where judgment is called for. But to your question, I observed something years ago in politics that made an enormous impression on me. It's something I've never forgotten. This is before your time, but in the election of 1992, Clinton, Perot, the elder Bush, there were a series of debates, and the third debate was a town hall. And this is literally the I feel your pain moment. The I feel your pain moment, although that's not what Bill Clinton, the phrase he used at the time, occurred as follows. A woman stood up, black woman, older, obviously or visibly very nervous at being on TV for the one and only time in her life and in front of tens of millions of people. And she said in kind of an uncertain voice, I would like to ask each of the candidates how you personally have been affected by the deficit. So total terror and consternation. No one has been personally affected by the deficit. What are you talking about? So to make the long story short, Bush flubbed the question. Perot gave a characteristically insane answer. And Bill Clinton replied, he got to go third, so he had time to think. He said, I will answer your question, but first answer mine. How have you personally been affected by the deficit? And he stood with that huge body as he moved it closer to her. She was very tiny. And she began to answer the question, and as she answered, it became clear she didn't mean the deficit at all. She was talking about the recession that was happening at the same time. And whether she didn't exactly know the difference or whether she'd been confused because she was nervous about being on TV, she'd mixed them up. Well, once he understood that, he could then that's the I feel your, he gave this powerful answer. But what he understood was, what Clinton figured out is the language of politics is for most people a learned language, a foreign language, full of words and concepts they don't exactly understand. And the job of a politician is to hear the question behind the question. And so I think the way you redeem Trump voters from where they are is by hearing the question behind their question and answering that. But I am not a politician, so I get to say, if you support Trump, you're doing a bad thing.